The knock at my door came just after midnight, a dull, deliberate sound that reverberated through the quiet of my cabin. I'd been halfway through a glass of cheap bourbon when I heard it, and I was tempted to ignore it altogether. In my line of work, nothing good ever arrived at that hour. I stood groaning as the weight of exhaustion pulled at my joints and opened the door. No one was there, just a damp chill rolling in from the forest. But at my feet lay a parcel, wrapped in water-stained leather and tied with twine. Something about it felt old, not just worn, but ancient. I brought it inside, set it down on the table, and carefully unwound the twine. The leather unfolded with a dry crackle, revealing a single sheet of yellowed paper covered in hurried scrawl. My heart skipped as I saw the name signed at the bottom: Elias Norwood. Elias had been a friend once, a man who was both brilliant and obsessive. The last I'd heard of him was years ago, after he'd gone missing on an expedition near Black Hollow. Authorities had called it a tragic accident, claiming the mines were unstable and prone to collapse. But even then, I'd suspected there was more to it. The note was brief but chilling. "Marcus, they've found something beneath the earth. I was right all along. This isn't some myth or metaphor. It's alive, and it's waking up. They're preparing for its birth, and Black Hollow has fallen under its shadow. If I disappear, it means they've taken me. I pray it's not too late for you to stop them. Come quickly. Everything depends on it. Elias Norwood." The ink was smeared in places, as if written in haste or fear. There was something else in the package too, a small, crudely drawn map. Black Hollow's old quarry was circled in red. The room felt smaller somehow, suffocating. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the note, turning over every possibility in my mind. Elias wasn't the type to scare easily. If he'd sent this, it meant the situation was worse than I'd imagined. I took a deep breath and closed my eyes. Black Hollow. It wasn't just a name, it was a place steeped in tragedy. A mining town that had been gutted by disaster and left for dead. I'd avoided it for years. Now it felt like fate was dragging me back. By dawn, I was packed and on the road. The sky was a cold, pale gray, and the forests lining the highway were thick with mist. The drive to Black Hollow was long and lonely, the kind that makes you feel like you're slipping between worlds. When I finally reached the outskirts, I was greeted by silence. No welcome signs, no life, just rows of dilapidated houses and rusting machinery crumbling beneath the weight of years. The town had an emptiness that clung to it like smoke. I parked near the old general store and stepped out, immediately feeling eyes on me. In the distance, a woman was sweeping her porch. She paused when she saw me, her face sunken and pale. She didn't smile or wave, just stared before turning back inside, as if afraid to be seen for too long. I walked toward the center of town. The streets were lined with abandoned vehicles and sagging storefronts. The smell of damp earth and metal lingered in the air. Black Hollow had been hollowed out in every way that mattered. The only place that showed any signs of life was the church. A crude, hand-painted sign outside read, "Sunday Gathering, Hope for the Chosen." I stepped closer and peered through the warped glass windows. Inside, a few townsfolk sat in silence, while a gaunt figure at the pulpit delivered a low, droning sermon. His voice barely carried, but even muffled, there was something in his tone that twisted my stomach. He wasn't preaching hope. He was preaching something else. Submission. I moved on quickly, heading toward the quarry. Elias' map was burned into my mind. If he'd found something, it would be there. The path wound through the forest, the trees growing denser and darker with every step. There was no birdsong, no rustling of leaves, just an unnatural stillness that made my skin crawl. When I finally emerged at the edge of the quarry, I felt my breath catch. The ground yawned open into a vast pit of blackened rock, crisscrossed with scaffolding and rusted equipment. But the strangest part was the carvings. They were etched deep into the stone, forming strange looping patterns that almost seemed to shimmer. They looked biological, like veins and tendons rather than carvings made by human hands. Something moved near the bottom of the pit, a slow, shuffling procession of figures cloaked in robes. I crouched behind an outcropping, my pulse hammering in my ears. The figures gathered around an altar of sorts, hewn from the quarry's stone. At first I thought it was a crude statue, but as I watched, the surface of the altar shifted. Thin, root-like tendrils sprouted from its base, curling into the stone. The robed figures began to chant in a language I didn't recognize. The sound wasn't loud, but it felt like it pressed against my skull, a resonance that made my teeth ache. One of them dragged a large, wriggling sack toward the altar and untied it. A man stumbled out, filthy, half-conscious, and bound at the wrists. His face was gaunt, but I recognized him instantly. Elias. I almost called out, but my voice caught in my throat. The cultists raised their hands toward the altar, and the tendrils began to writhe. I reached for my revolver, knowing I couldn't just stand there. But something stopped me. The altar opened. It wasn't stone. It wasn't even solid. The surface split apart like the petals of some grotesque flower, revealing a mass of translucent flesh pulsing with a dim, sickly glow. I could see shapes moving beneath its surface, limbs, eyes, organs, forming and unforming in a constant cycle of grotesque creation. I turned away, bile rising in my throat. The sound of Elias's screams cut through the air as I forced myself to look again. The tendrils had latched onto him, burrowing beneath his skin. His body spasmed as the alien matter coiled through his veins like living wire. I knew I couldn't save him, not now. All I could do was survive. I backed away slowly, my boots scraping against loose gravel. One of the robed figures turned, their hollow eyes meeting mine for a split second. I ran. I didn't stop running until I reached the tree line, lungs burning and legs screaming in protest. I pressed my back against the rough bark of an old pine, forcing myself to stay quiet. My heart pounded in my chest like a war drum, loud enough to drown out the sounds of the forest, or lack thereof. No footsteps followed, no shouts of alarm. It was like they hadn't even cared that I was there. I waited until my breathing slowed, then checked my surroundings. My revolver was still holstered at my side. I hadn't even drawn it. The realization sent a wave of anger through me, at myself, at my weakness. I'd come here to find Elias, to stop whatever was happening in this godforsaken town, and I'd run at the first sign of horror. But it wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, more primal. The sight of that thing in the quarry, the living, writhing mass pretending to be an altar, had triggered something buried deep in my mind. A memory older than humanity itself. I had seen something that didn't belong in this world, and some part of me knew that looking too long would unmake me. By the time I made it back to the outskirts of Black Hollow, the sky had darkened. The town looked even more lifeless under the dim twilight. Shadows stretched long over the cracked pavement, and the windows of the houses were like empty sockets. The only lights came from the old church, where a dim glow flickered behind stained glass warped with age. I needed answers. If Elias was still alive, or something close to alive, I had to know how this all began. I headed for the only lead I had left, the old chapel where Elias had rented a room when he first arrived in Black Hollow. The chapel was one of the few buildings that still looked intact. The door creaked open under my touch, revealing a small, dusty interior. There were no pews, only long rows of mismatched chairs. A crude wooden cross hung at the far end, but even from the entrance I could see the cracks splintering through its surface. I found Elias's room in the back, an unfinished corner with a cot, a desk, and shelves overflowing with books. Most of the titles were what I expected: journals on archaeology, mythology, and alien biology. But some of the notebooks were Elias's personal writings, their pages covered in tight, frantic handwriting. I flipped through the first few pages and felt the hair on my arms rise. It's not a god, it's an organism, a life form beyond classification. The cult calls it Nyx Tharis, but that's not a name. It's an approximation of something older, something that doesn't fit in our language. I turned another page. They aren't just summoning it, they're making it, growing it. The altar isn't a place of worship, it's a womb. The minerals in the quarry. They aren't stone. They're the creature's tissue, fossilized until the cult discovered how to awaken it. My stomach churned. The diagrams in the notebook were almost worse than the words. Cross-sections of humanoid figures spliced with alien tissue, their bones warping into jagged spirals. The drawings of veins and organs looked wrong. Too many branching paths, too many nerves threading through the flesh like spider silk. The final page I read made me shut the notebook and step away. The human body is incomplete. They believe it's waiting to become something else, something finished. The altar is a seedbed for transformation, and they've already started using it. The weight of it all settled over me like a stone slab. I could feel it in my own body, the way my muscles felt sluggish, the phantom itch beneath my skin. I hadn't been near the altar for long, but long enough. I needed to get out, to breathe air that wasn't thick with rot and madness. I stepped outside, and the cold air hit me like a slap. The streets were still deserted, but I could hear something faint. A low hum beneath the surface of the earth. It wasn't mechanical, it was organic. A slow, steady pulse, like the heartbeat of something enormous sleeping beneath my feet. I followed the sound instinctively, moving through the narrow back streets until I reached the old mining office near the edge of town. The front door was chained shut, but the side window had been shattered long ago. I climbed through and landed in a room filled with crumbling ledgers and dust-covered maps. The hum was louder here, vibrating through the floorboards. There was a trap door behind the desk, its edges warped from years of moisture. I pried it open and stared down into the darkness below. The hum became a roar in my skull. I clicked on my flashlight and descended the ladder into the black. The air grew thicker with every step down, saturated with the metallic tang of blood and something else, something chemical like ammonia. The bottom of the ladder opened into a cavern that shouldn't have been there. The walls pulsed faintly, like veins filled with dim bioluminescence. Tendrils of something half organic, half mineral coiled through the rock like vines. In the center of the chamber was something even worse than the altar. It looked like a nest or a nursery. There were shapes encased in translucent sacks hanging from the ceiling. Some of them twitched. I moved closer, my gut twisted into knots. The figures inside the sacks were human, or had been once. Their faces were stretched, their limbs fused into strange new shapes. Bone and cartilage sprouted in places they shouldn't, like coral growing in slow motion. Their eyes were open but unseeing, their mouths twitching in silent agony. One of the sacks burst with a wet, sickening rip, spilling out a half-formed shape that flopped onto the floor. Its torso was split by a jagged seam, exposing ribs that curved outward like insect mandibles. It tried to breathe, its lungs shuddering with a wet, gargling sound. I didn't think, I just raised the revolver and pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the chamber and the thing stopped moving. The hum deepened and the walls of the cavern trembled. I looked around, realizing too late that the sound wasn't coming from the sacks or the creatures. It was coming from the earth itself. Whatever lay beneath was stirring. I holstered the revolver and turned to run, but a figure blocked my path. It was Malkan, the cult leader. His face was pale, his eyes wide with something between ecstasy and madness. "Do you feel it?" he asked, stepping closer. "The pulse? The first contraction?" His voice sent chills down my spine. I reached for my gun, but Malkan only smiled. "It's too late," he whispered. "You've already been touched by it. You're changing." I shoved past him and climbed the ladder 2 rungs at a time, ignoring the burning in my legs. Malkin's laughter echoed behind me, growing fainter as I reached the surface. I stumbled out into the night, gasping for air. I was too late to save Elias, but maybe I wasn't too late to stop this. The hum followed me, lingering beneath the earth like the fading beat of a dying heart, or a waking one. The morning sky was the color of ash, muted and dead. I hadn't slept. The hum that haunted the town seemed louder in my head now, like my pulse had aligned with it. No matter how far I walked or how deep I breathed, I couldn't escape the sensation that something inside me had begun to shift. I stared at my reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror of the chapel. My skin looked waxy, pale beneath the grime and sweat. My pupils were uneven, one slightly larger than the other. I splashed cold water on my face, watching droplets trace the faint network of veins beneath my skin. They looked darker, almost branching in ways veins shouldn't. Malkan's words echoed in my skull. "You're changing." I leaned forward, inspecting the faint bruises forming along my forearms. The itch beneath my skin was unbearable now, a deep, crawling sensation that no amount of scratching could soothe. Panic flared in my chest as I grabbed my hunting knife from my belt and pressed the edge against my forearm. You need to know. With a quick, sharp pull, I dragged the blade down my skin. Pain flared bright and hot as blood welled up and trickled down my arm. But something else emerged too. Something small and black, embedded deep in the tissue. I clenched my jaw and pinched it with trembling fingers, pulling it free. It was a shard of something, not bone, not stone. The fragment was slick and warm to the touch, pulsing faintly in rhythm with my heartbeat. I dropped it into the sink and it made a wet clink as it landed. I stared at it, breathless, before wrapping a strip of cloth around my arm. There was no denying it now. The cult's influence wasn't just external, it was inside me. But I wasn't going to let them take me without a fight. I grabbed my gear and headed back to the quarry. The path wound through the forest like a jagged scar, twisting down toward the black maw of the pit. The entrance loomed ahead, darker than I remembered, the carvings on its walls almost writhing in the dim light. I descended the same ladder I'd climbed before, my flashlight cutting a narrow beam through the gloom. The quarry floor was colder this time, and the hum vibrated through my boots. The air was thick, reeking of iron and something acrid like spoiled meat. The path led me to the same cavern, but I noticed something new. The walls had changed. They'd grown. The organic tendrils had spread further, spiraling out like veins feeding a monstrous heart. At the center of the chamber, the sacks still hung from the ceiling, translucent and glistening. More of them now. Dozens. Their forms twitched inside, half-human shapes pressing against the membrane, as though desperate to escape. I moved past them, stepping over slick pools of fluid as I headed deeper. The cavern narrowed into a long tunnel, its walls alive with a faint, pulsing glow. My stomach twisted with every step, but I forced myself to press on. The hum grew louder, vibrating the stone beneath my feet. The tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber, larger than any natural cavern I'd ever seen. The walls pulsed with faint bioluminescence, casting the space in a sickly green glow. And there, at the far end, was the thing the cult had been working toward, the nursery. It was a colossal structure, suspended by thick tendrils that pulsed with alien fluid. It looked like a cocoon, its surface smooth and wet, veined with dark lines that throbbed like arteries. The thing inside shifted, its form indistinct and massive. I took a step forward, and the ground beneath me squelched. I glanced down to see the floor covered in a thin layer of viscous liquid, dark and warm. The air was alive with a wet, rhythmic sound, the sound of something breathing. At the base of the cocoon, I saw something else, a pile of bodies. Some were old, little more than skeletal remains entangled in alien roots. Others were fresh, their skin stretched tight over their bones, mouths frozen in silent screams. And among them, I saw Elias. His body was slack, his skin pale and glistening with sweat, but he was still alive. His chest rose and fell with shallow, uneven breaths. I knelt beside him, brushing away the tangle of tendrils that had coiled around his arms and legs. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first. Then they locked onto mine, filled with a flicker of recognition. "Marcus?" His voice was a rasp, barely more than a whisper. "I'm here," I said, gripping his shoulder. I'm going to get you out." He shook his head weakly. "It's too late." His gaze shifted to the cocoon, and I saw the terror etched into his features. "You don't understand. It's growing." A sound echoed through the chamber, a deep, wet crack like splitting bone. I looked up just as a fissure formed down the center of the cocoon. Pale fluid gushed from the seam as the surface peeled back, revealing the thing inside. It was enormous, its body a grotesque amalgamation of muscle, cartilage, and twitching limbs. Its skin was translucent, revealing the organs that churned beneath. Its face, or what passed for a face, was a shifting mass of eyes, each one blinking at different intervals. A long serpentine limb unfurled from its torso, lined with jagged, teeth-like protrusions. Elias gripped my arm. "You have to destroy it." I nodded, heart hammering in my chest. I reached into my pack and pulled out the charges I'd brought, the last resort. I planted them along the base of the cocoon, setting the timers with shaking hands. The creature shifted, its massive form pressing against the cocoon's ruptured shell. A low, guttural moan filled the cavern, vibrating the very air around me. I grabbed Elias, pulling him to his feet. "We need to move, now." We stumbled toward the tunnel as the cocoon began to collapse, the alien tissue sloughing off in massive, wet sheets. The creature's moan rose to a deafening wail, a sound that pierced straight through my skull. The charges detonated behind us, and the entire cavern shook. A blinding flash of light filled the tunnel as the ground heaved beneath our feet. I felt Elias' grip slip from mine, and I turned just in time to see him fall. The tunnel wall crumbled, separating us as a cascade of stone crashed down. "Elias!" I screamed, but there was no response, only the rumble of the collapsing earth. I stumbled forward, the tunnel narrowing as more debris fell. By the time I reached the surface, the quarry was a smoking ruin. I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath as the echoes of the explosion faded into silence. The hum was gone, but as I lay there, staring up at the gray sky, I felt something stir beneath my skin, a faint, pulsing rhythm that hadn't been there before, and I knew the nightmare wasn't over. The town of Black Hollow was burning behind me, the sky choked with ash and smoke. The forest that once surrounded the quarry was splintered and scorched from the blast. But it wasn't over. I knew that as surely as I knew the rhythm of my own heartbeat. I felt it, thrumming beneath the earth. Fainter now, but still alive, still growing. I stumbled toward the ridge overlooking the remains of the quarry, blood seeping from cuts along my arms and legs. My breath was ragged, my vision blurred by exhaustion and pain. Below me, the pit was a smoldering crater of rubble and ash, but in the center, where the cocoon had been, I saw movement. It had survived. The creature's body was still emerging from the debris, grotesquely reshaping itself. Its limbs twitched as new sinews knitted together, its translucent flesh reforming over exposed muscle and bone. It shouldn't have been possible, but there it was, a monument to something beyond death, beyond reason. It writhed like a newborn taking its first breath of air. Tears of frustration blurred my eyes. I'd sacrificed everything to stop this, and still it wasn't enough. My fingers brushed against the revolver at my hip. Instinct, habit. But I knew it was useless. Bullets wouldn't kill something like this. No weapon built by human hands could unmake it. But there was one thing left. I pressed my hand to my chest, feeling the faint, alien pulse beneath my skin. It had been growing inside me ever since I'd entered the nursery, feeding on my fear, my pain. I wasn't just a hunter anymore. I was infected. A part of me belonged to it now. "You're changing," Malkan's voice echoed in my mind, cruel and mocking. But maybe that change wasn't a curse. It was a key. I could feel it, the connection between me and the creature. A tether forged in blood and madness. And if I could feel it, maybe I could end it. I rose to my feet, ignoring the protests of my battered body. The wind screamed around me as I climbed down the jagged slope toward the pit. The air thickened with the stench of burning flesh and wet stone. The creature sensed me. It stopped writhing, its many eyes snapping open in unison, fixing me with a gaze that pierced through my bones. The hum returned, vibrating in my skull like the ringing of a distant bell. But this time I didn't flinch. I stepped forward, locking eyes with the thing that had consumed so many lives. My voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "I see you." The creature shuddered, its massive serpent-like limb coiled toward me, the jagged teeth along its length quivering as it closed in. I felt its thoughts pressing against mine, alien, ancient, and vast. It wasn't just a beast, it was aware, and it knew me. Images flashed through my mind, worlds collapsing, civilizations consumed, endless galaxies swallowed whole. But there was something deeper beneath the chaos, hunger. It was a being that devoured to become whole, to perfect itself, and it wanted to finish what it had started. With me. I reached out as the limb coiled closer, the air crackling between us. My fingers brushed the slick, writhing surface of its flesh, and the hum surged through me like a live wire. Pain tore through my veins, and I felt my body buckle under the weight of it. But I didn't let go. I closed my eyes and focused on the pulse, the shared rhythm that bound us. I could feel the alien cells within me, twisting, changing, becoming. But I could also feel myself, my memories, my anger, my grief, all the things that made me human. I pushed back. The hum faltered. The creature writhed, its limbs convulsing as the connection deepened. I felt its confusion, its fear. It had never expected resistance, not from something so small. But I wasn't small, not anymore. "You don't get to take this world," I whispered, tightening my grip. "Not today." I opened myself to the tether between us and sent everything I had, every ounce of rage, pain, and defiance, surging into the core of the thing. I forced it to feel what it meant to be mortal, to live with fear, love, and loss. I poured my memories into it, the faces of the people I'd lost, the sound of Elias' last breath, the screams of the townsfolk it had consumed. The creature spasmed, its form twisting and collapsing in on itself. The hum became a deafening wail, a sound that made the earth quake beneath my feet. I felt its limbs thrashing wildly, but I didn't let go, even as its flesh burned and tore, even as my own body screamed in agony. I held on. The light around us dimmed, folding in on itself as the creature began to unravel. Its body collapsed into a mass of twitching sinew and ash, disintegrating in waves of burning light. The connection between us snapped like a frayed cord, and I was thrown backward, hitting the ground with bone-jarring force. Silence fell over the quarry, thick and absolute. I lay there, staring up at the sky as the dust began to settle. The hum was gone, truly gone this time. I couldn't feel its presence anymore. No pulse beneath my skin, no whisper in the back of my mind. Just quiet. But I wasn't sure if I'd won. My body felt hollow, stretched thin. My vision blurred as I tried to sit up, but exhaustion pulled me back down. Somewhere in the distance, I heard voices, faint but real, human. The search party from the neighboring town, maybe. They'd come looking after the explosion. I closed my eyes as the footsteps drew closer. Part of me wanted to rest, to believe it was finally over. But another part whispered that the thing I'd fought was only one fragment of something larger. One pulse in a universe filled with horrors still waiting to wake. I opened my eyes again, staring at the pale, empty sky. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I took a breath that was truly my own. It was over, at least for now.